Hey there, my name is Betsy Woodruff, and I'm a William F. Buckley Fellow with National Review.
And my name is Jordan Bloom. I'm the Associate Editor of the American Conservative.
And I guess today what we're supposed to be talking about is the future of the GOP and the conservative movement, which is, I'd say, pretty easy to cover in about 10 minutes or so. Not that complicated. And we wanted to start off by talking about one of the more interesting news events from this week. Jordan went to Rand Paul's speech at Howard University. I did not get to go to it, which was unfortunate, but I would love to hear your take on that, Jordan, and I don't know what you sensed, if you intuited anything, etc.
Yeah, well, I guess the general consensus coming out of it seems to be that, he did what needed to happen. Some effort needs to be made to reach out to black voters, and as far as his, whether or not he was effective at doing it, I'd say it was pretty good. It was definitely mixed. In terms of he was definitely more effective when he was talking about policy. The kind of big announcement, or the thing that kind of was synchronized with the speech, was his new announcement about legislation eliminating mandatory minimums, and that was good and definitely well received. It was the one line he really got a lot of applause for. What was less successful is there's kind of this trope whenever GOP lawmakers talk to black people or talk about black people, they tend to emphasize the 19th century and early 20th century history of the Republican Party, pro civil rights, pro expanding the franchise, but a lot of that really is beside the point, and you kind of got the impression that most of the people in the audience felt that way as well. So I'd say that would have been less successful. And he didn't really do a very good job addressing issues like voter ID, the things that really are alienating black people from the party today. He didn't mention it at all, really. During the Q&A, he was asked about it, and his response was basically, you shouldn't be comparing voter ID to poll tests or literacy tests. And which, there were some commenters that were saying that's condescending, and, maybe they have a point. Regardless, it's not that effective. What I suggested in the blog post after the speech was that rather than focusing on the GOP's history, kind of going off of something that Michael Brennan Doherty said in an interview, is that there's a very rich, wonderful black intellectual tradition that emphasizes self-reliance, individualism, and that sort of thing. And he might have been better off talking about that, or talking about where there's some common ground there, rather than talking about a pretty irrelevant history. So that's kind of my take. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I just have trouble thinking that anyone's going to find the history of a political party from the 19th century to be at all compelling as far as how you vote. I mean, I can't imagine anything that I could say to a person who's not a member of my political party about something the party did 200 years ago that would interest them in changing party allegiance. It just strikes me as a little silly.
And moreover, if you're going to talk about that, you need to kind of get it right. And he screwed up the name of a particular senator, and the crowd had to correct him. The senator that he screwed up, I think it was Edward Brooks.
Yeah.
The crowd corrected him because the guy, I think, was a Howard alum.
Yeah.
And things like that don't look good, especially when you're coming off as kind of lecturing.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a little problematic. I think the other thing that's a little odd about emphasizing the Republican Party was started by Lincoln, taking that line of argument, is that it's like, geez, do you have nothing else to go on? It almost seems a little bit desperate, maybe. Sort of like this last ditch effort to sort of distract people from the, post-Nixonian racial struggles or post and pre, that the GOP had in the 20th century. And it's that whole line of reasoning that talking about Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass is going to be a successful way to attract minority voters to the Republican Party. It just seems to me a little odd. I don't think it's problematic to bring up. It's interesting. It's sort of a fun fact. but making that your strategy, or I don't know, the central point of how you court minority voters is just, I don't really see that working well at all, you know. But I think it's cool they went into the mandatory minimum stuff. I feel like, and did you talk about drones at all?
Briefly. I don't think it was really an emphasis, though.
Yeah. I think that's mandatory minimums is definitely an area where, and it's not really an area where the GOP can make headway because it's not that much of a GOP issue. You know, like Rand Paul's the only guy talking about it. But I think with minority voter outreach, Republicans are likely to be more successful if individual candidates kind of reach out for themselves rather than the RNC as a corporate body saying, you know, sort of fighting for party allegiance. I think it's much more likely that minority voters are going to get excited and interested by individuals, you know, like Rand Paul or Marco Rubio or Susana Martinez or what have you, then they are going to be convinced that the Republican Party sort of as a corporate whole is something that they should be attracted to or find compelling. Because I think in contemporary America, like the Republican Party has been successful. The successes that it's have had, you know, from what I can understand, haven't had a ton to do with party outreach, capital P, capital O, and it's had a lot more to do with, you know, individuals who are compelling and interesting and who make arguments that make sense. So this whole idea that we sort of need to corporatize minority outreach doesn't strike me as something that would be uniquely successful.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you think there's, besides Rand Paul, and Marco Rubio, kind of the obvious ones, do any Republicans in particular strike you as people who could successfully do minority outreach?
I'd have to think about that one. Off the top of my head, there isn't anyone that particularly, you know, leaps to mind, I guess.
Yeah. Alan West.
Which is, I guess, the problem.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That was really interesting. Okay, well, another thing that I think we wanted to talk about, and sort of given that we're talking about Rand Paul and changes in the conservative movement in the direction that it's going, is sort of this new libertarian wing of the party. Your Justin Amash, Bridenstine, Thomas Massey types in the House. Obviously, you have Rand Paul in the Senate. Senators Cruz and Lee aren't libertarian, but they've had some, you know, they seem to have some kind of libertarian impulses. And one thing that I'm curious about your take on, Jordan, is how that wing informs the party, and then also if it's possible to reconcile some basic conservative principles with this libertarian ideology or set of ideas or what have you.
Well, it seems like what you're talking about, and what we're talking about when you're dealing with the question of how radical a stance the Republican Party should take, is whether or not the project should be to conserve the institutions we have today, or to be hard at work rolling back the size of government, rolling back substantially social services, rolling back what have you, rolling back, frankly, our defense commitments, or more than that. But that tension is not necessarily libertarian versus conservative. That's a tension that's always been extant in conservatism as well, all the way back to the 50s and even before. So it makes sense to say libertarianism is a revolutionary force, and I think it's fair to say that most libertarians think of themselves that way. But at least as a policy question and as a debate about where the party should be going, it's something that goes on within both libertarianism and conservatism, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me about libertarianism, and this is pretty much purely based on anecdotal evidence, is that while the libertarian impulse seems to be fundamentally progressive from what I can tell, most people who are libertarian, it seem to either come from the right or be more attracted to the right than to the left. Like, the GOP has a kind of libertarian-ish wing. You know, like you said, there's always been that tension. But
explain to me what you mean by progressive.
Progressive in the sense of, so if conservatism means emphasizing maintaining traditions, maintaining social order, having a sense of reverence for the past, not taking for granted that we live in a functioning society, and being sort of fundamentally pessimistic about the prospects from human innovation. And if progressivism is sort of the opposite of that, kind of a more suspicious view of traditions, institutions, and a greater optimism for the prospects of dramatic reform, revolution, quick change, etc. And I think libertarianism, from what I sense, would fall more into the progressive camp, in the sense that you don't have libertarians that strike me as particularly interested in sort of a devotion to tradition, the way that you have a lot of conservatives, your Buckley types, your Reagan types, who viewed the Western heritage with a sense of almost exaggerated reverence. I don't think you get that as much with libertarians. I think in libertarians, obviously there is that, and that element is present. But I think as a whole, more libertarians are interested in making changes, making them quickly, moving forward, rather than in sort of trying to buckle down and keep what you got. If that makes sense? I don't know if that's a fair analysis.
And I think it's fair to say that that they're progressive in almost the view towards history, skeptical towards tradition, has a real sense of a real certitude as to where they feel like the country ought to go. But I think it's maybe a little bit confusing to use that term, because even from the early stages of the progressive movement, like with the social gospelers and things like that, they all saw a very active role for government. And so I'm a little cautious about applying that term to libertarians.
I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that progressivism entails an energetic government, and that to that extent, right? I think it's fair to say it's tricky to use the word.
And not only that, I think the thing that libertarians need to work out as they're negotiating their place in the Republican Party is how anarchic they're going to be. One thing about the libertarian legislators that we have, like Justin Amash and Rand Paul, is a lot of their even fairly extreme anti-government positions are framed in terms of law and order. They have great respect for the rule of law, and I would say a lot of the more intellectual and anarchic libertarians maybe don't have that, and are skeptical of the entire project of government, as opposed to just having a very minimal view of what it is. And that's basically why, trying to make libertarians political is like herding cats.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think there's something about the libertarian mindset that's kind of fundamentally anti-political, and that could have something to do with why they haven't been a more significant political force. I mean, if you think about, if we talk about this in terms of lobbies, and I think if we talk about libertarians as a lobby rather than as a political movement, sort of in the same way that environmentalists have a lobby and school choice advocates have a lobby, it's not been very effective, like, at all. And I think, Gary Johnson got like 1 million votes in the 2012 election, and you really don't see, from what I can tell, much success from libertarians as far as changing public policy outcomes.
I think that's fair, but the big caveat to that, and when you look at some of the polling that's conducted, I think that like the recent poll that they always do of who's a libertarian out there, the definition they take is just anyone who's socially liberal and economically conservative. And the problem with that is that it also encompasses most moderate Republicans. So there's the fact that generally a lot of the country is moving in a direction that's more sympathetic to libertarian ideas, but libertarianism as something that people self-identify as kind of a school of thought is still, I think, not very attractive to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I think libertarians' PR leaves a bit to be desired. I think that's absolutely fair that it's not particularly attractive. That's been a hard sell. What do you think libertarians could do to make their ideas more compelling to the general public, or do you think that's even part of the libertarian project?
Well, there are a whole lot of different libertarians, and there are a whole lot of projects to make libertarianism more palatable. And I think you see in a lot of these, like Mises Institute, Austrian hardcore Church of Austrian economics folks is just a dogmatic adherence to a certain a small number of thinkers, and often a dogmatic adherence to the non-aggression principle. And a lot of the more, I guess, for lack of a better word, modern-ish libertarians kind of understand the drawbacks of that. There was a really great back and forth on libertarianism.org this week about the non-aggression principle, which is the idea that it's kind of the basis for libertarian morality, that the one thing that government should protect against, or I guess you don't even necessarily need government to do it, but to protect from aggression against someone else. And I guess it's not really useful. It's not really all that useful as a political principle, is what this kind of back and forth at Cicado Institute website. So they're libertarians that are working through some of the maybe contradictions or less useful ideas in the libertarian canon, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying being anti-politics is not a very useful political principle?
I'm all for being anti-politics. I think it's completely fair to be anti-politics, and maybe it's better for libertarians to be that way in the long run, and especially if the country is moving in their direction anyway. Maybe there's not really a need to be political.
Yeah. Do you think?
But at the same time, it has limitations when you're trying to make the case that the government should be different than it is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, for sure. So do you think this argument that the libertarian wing of the party is the future of the Republican Party, what's your take on that? That if the Republican Party starts looking more libertarian, it will be more successful, and to the extent that it becomes more socially liberal and fiscally conservative, it will.
So, when people make that case, it's framed as kind of a historical inevitability, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone is getting more socially liberal. Everyone's making their peace with the drug war. It's politically unpopular, and everyone's moving in a more peace-minded, less aggressive, or taking a less aggressive view toward foreign policy. And there's probably some truth to that. But if you're going to talk in terms of inexorable historical forces, how about the inexorable growth of the welfare state? So I think it's possible that we are inexorably moving in some directions that are a lot less favorable to libertarians too.
I think that's true, and I don't think there's really a modern example of a nation moving towards this libertarian ideal. I don't think it's fair to say that that's kind of the natural course of human events. Maybe, but I can't think of one.
Well, a lot of conservatives like to make fun of Scandinavia, but I think Sweden is a pretty interesting recent example of a country that's liberalized a lot of its economic policy, and there are other places too. And I guess you could even make the case that Margaret Thatcher moved England in a more libertarian direction, even though she wasn't by any means one.
I think that's fair. But at the same time, those are kind of exceptions that prove the rule, right? Yeah. Thatcher's England and Sweden does not a compelling case for the natural libertarian line of human events make. Right,
and neither is Iceland, or prehistoric Iceland, or whatever.
Yeah, right. And I wonder how much of that is. I think you can absolutely argue that America is becoming more socially liberal, slowly, and I think it's very much balkanized geographically, as far as what areas of the country are socially liberal and which ones are socially conservative. But I think there's a decent argument that, well, I think there's a very good argument that, gay marriage being sort of the easy example here, that the country's moving in a more socially liberal direction. But at the same time, I think the inevitability of fiscal conservatism is a very hard sell. And I wonder how much of that is because there's not really a good figurehead arguing for fiscal conservatism. And, there's always that meme of, blame the Bush years. But I think it's fair to argue that there really isn't a person who's cut his or her teeth on pushing for fiscal conservatism on a national level. I don't think we have national politicians that are really making that their identity, or definitely not politicians pre-2010, pre-2008.
And one of the strongest arguments that libertarians have for not wanting to work with the Republican Party is that government tends to grow faster under Republicans, and that's completely fair. That the Republican Party has not been very faithfully committed to that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
until
I think
now,
that's true.
Until now, when I guess they find it maybe one of the better cases they can be making.
Yeah, and it's funny to me that there's kind of an odd overlap between the Tea Party and the Liberty Movement for libertarians. I feel like you see a lot of people who identify as Tea Party, but also really like Amash or really like Bridenstine, and I think that's kind of an interesting place for, I don't know, fusionism or for groups to kind of merge together. I'm curious what your take is on that too. Do you think that the Republican grassroots is going to be sort of a neat fusion of people who are libertarian, anti-war, socially liberal, and people who are really diehard Constitution supporters, anti-Obamacare activists? Like, is there a room for those groups to come together, or do you think they're just going to be disparate?
Well, I guess one of the things we were thinking about talking about was kind of the Tea Party's legacy, and I think it's maybe too early to tell. Mm-hmm. At the national level, of course, you have, one could see it as a failure of the Tea Party movement that you have someone like Senator Toomey working on gun control legislation, and you have Senator Rubio working on immigration reform. Mm-hmm. But what's going to be really interesting, and I think where the Tea Party's most lasting legacy is going to be, is not there. We have yet to see what's going to happen with this massive crop of state legislators that have grown up in the Tea Party and now are getting a lot of pretty substantial experience in state legislatures. And it seems very plausible that some of those people are eventually going to be very competent and very, real movers and shakers. But it's, again, it's probably too early to say.
Any state legislators that stick out to you in particular?
To be honest, I don't follow state legislatures all that closely.
No, that's okay. I think Will Weatherford in Florida, who's their Speaker of the House, people kind of say he's a rising star. That's going to be an interesting career to watch. And I wouldn't describe him as libertarian at all. I mean, he's socially conservative. But he sort of led the charge against pushing back on Governor Scott's acceptance of the Medicaid expansion. And if Medicaid expansion doesn't come to Florida, it's basically going to be because he's Speaker of the House. So I think that's one state level person to keep an eye on. Who's the Oklahoma Speaker of the House? I don't remember what his name is. A.W. Simons, maybe, is supposed to be another guy to watch. Besides that, though, yeah, I have trouble thinking of state legislators. But yeah, I think that's true that the bench is going to be deeper in 4 years, maybe than it is now. And that could be part of potentially tectonic shift, I guess. Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Something that I find kind of interesting about Rubio is that he's very good at laying out a case for fiscal conservatism, I think on a rhetorical level. I think he might be the best as far as talking about why free markets matter, arguing against the regulatory state, arguing for limited government, for entitlement reform, etc. I think he could be a person who'd be able to do that in a way that would be compelling to voters who aren't dogmatic either way about entitlements and fiscal responsibility. I think his immigrant background sort of gives him some authority to talk about free markets and the ability of free markets to sort of enable prosperity, progress, etc. But I have trouble thinking of another.
Ted Cruz calls the opportunity conservatism.
Yeah.
Of course, in Cruz and Rubio, you have these committed fiscal conservatives that and especially Rubio, his rise was propelled and pumped by a lot of Washington neoconservative types. And you had his big American exceptionalism speech that didn't really seem all that consistent with anything Rubio had been saying prior to that point. So color me skeptical as far as he goes, because he seems, just a little bit opportunistic.
That's fair enough. Are you more skeptical about Rubio or Cruz?
Well, both of them are I think there's a tension for both of them between their stated fiscal conservatism and their commitment to sustain high levels of defense spending. So some of the fear-mongering, Rubio on Rubio's part about China, I think, is especially ill-founded. And I'm one of those people who don't think it would be a disaster if we would retrench in East Asia and turn over some of our strategic commitments to them, with the exception probably of Taiwan. But Rubio, if we were to do that, you can bet both Rubio and Cruz would be using it as a bludgeon against Obama.
As far as potential to be successful national political figures, do you think Cruz or Rubio is more likely to ascend quicker?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think Rubio's impressive because he actually does have his experience in the state legislature, and he has a lot of experience in the real nitty-gritty of crafting legislation and that sort of thing. And he seems, at least with this immigration stuff, he knows how to bring people together, craft a message, and then this weekend he's going to be going on all 7 Sunday shows, so he knows how to sell it. He's actually taking it upon himself to be that salesman. So I think that's pretty impressive. But Cruz is also a pretty impressive salesman too.
I think Rubio has much more crossover appeal than Cruz does. If I had to, and this is where Rubio's immigration reform push, I think, as has been said before, is very risky. But if I had to bet which one would, I don't know, become president or win the Republican nominee, my guess would be that it would be Rubio rather than Cruz. I think Cruz obviously is very popular with grassroots, with activists. I mean, at CPAC, you practically could have sold Ted Cruz fingernail clippings, and then people would have lined up for them. They just love him. But I think I don't necessarily see him as a person who's going to be able to make converts, if that makes sense. Maybe.
Yeah, but I
think Rubio is going to be much better at sort of bringing people into the fold than Cruz will. I think Cruz can come off as a little bit bombastic, and I don't know if that's necessarily an effective rhetorical tool.
Absolutely, and in all the writing I've seen about Ted Cruz, he definitely gets painted as something of a self-promoter.
Mm-hmm.
And but I guess the big question with Rubio is how much flack he's going to get for this immigration reform thing that comes out this weekend, if he's just going to completely alienate the Tea Party folks that led him to power in the first place.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And it's obviously being on the Gang of Eight and wheeling and dealing and compromising with a lot of high-profile Democrats, we're used to seeing Rubio do that. It's not odd, but I have trouble imagining Ted Cruz and Chuck Schumer ever working in tandem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think immigration, it's going to be interesting to see how Tea Party groups respond to immigration, and that almost seems like ground zero for them, because you have the Republicans on the Senate Budget Committee, who are just sort of digging their heels, no comprehensive immigration reform, too expensive, the entitlement load is going to be too heavy. I mean, Jeff Sessions has been adamant about his extreme suspicions that this legislation could be a good thing. And I don't think anyone's really questioning Sessions' fiscal conservative bona fides, I think. But at the same time, I think it's difficult to argue against comprehensive immigration reform if you don't have an alternative to it, or at least a serious proposal that could get velocity in Congress for securing the border or making a functioning guest worker program or what have you. And it's going to be really interesting to see how grassroots people respond to that. Also, given that it's kind of a heritage versus Americans for tax reform, there's a lot of internecine conflicts over immigration. And I think it's going to be a fun thing to watch as far as future of the conservative movement. Where's the conservative movement moving? How is it shifting? And yeah, it's a lot. It's obviously not a partisan issue, I don't think. So, popcorn.
And the guest worker program question is going to be especially interesting because a lot of the preliminary proposals I've been seeing with it is going to be much smaller than was expected. Mm-hmm. But it seems like a subject on which there should have been a lot of common ground. Mm-hmm. But more pessimistically, it could be seen as kind of a sop to agribusiness, mm-hmm. A way of fitting them into the comprehensive immigration reform issue without alienating the rest of the conservative base. But I guess we don't quite know yet what the final shape of that is going to be.
So interesting to keep an eye on. Any other stuff you wanted to talk about, or I don't know, moral of the story to wrap this up?
Let's see. I guess we were going to talk about why don't we have our own. Why isn't there a William F. Buckley or Russell Kirk or Ronald Reagan?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think I feel like the conservative movement's been very personality driven, and I don't think there's really a figurehead at this point who represents it. And we talked about this a little bit with Minority Outreach and Rand Paul about how it's much easier to sell people on a person than it is to sell them on a party or an institution.
And I don't think it's necessary or even desirable for there to be one William F. Buckley-like figure who has the power to excommunicate anyone he deems unconservative, even though there are certain people that try even today.
Yeah.
It's probably not good to have that sort of, for someone to be that effective at ideological enforcement anywhere. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are negative reasons for why there isn't one of those people. Mm-hmm. And I think one of them is kind of the institutional incentives of the conservative movement. They tend to elevate, for some reason, people that are... they tend to elevate people who are prone to overheated rhetoric, that are prone to short-term solutions, that are prone to making political points that are maybe not in the long-term interest of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. There's a lot gets written at the American Conservative about the bad incentives of conservatism incorporated, and I think there's a lot of truth there.
Mm-hmm. I think another problem is that Republicans tend to push people onto the national scene before they're ready. I think there's sort of this undercurrent of panic about not having a central figure, and the result of that is that you have people getting thrust into the spotlight before they might be totally vetted or completely ready for it. Sort of the obvious, easy example being Sarah Palin getting on the vice presidential ticket in 2008. But even with Cruz and Rubio, I think they're both very impressive. But we forget they're freshmen. I mean, this is Rubio's first term in Congress. Like, this is his first time in D.C. And I think it's reasonable for activists to raise eyebrows a bit that we're already talking about what Marco Rubio's first 100 days in the White House could be like.
Right, and even after he first got to the Senate, he was already mentioned as a 2012 contender.
Yeah,
which is completely absurd.
Yeah, right.
Maybe not. I mean, that Barack Obama was a freshman senator.
Yeah, I know. And we all saw how that worked out. Just kidding. But no, that's fair. I think I do think it could be problematic that Republicans are sort of waiting for this wonderkind to materialize, and I think that posturing or that instinct is probably not a healthy one. At the same time, there obviously is a lot of energy surrounded that fresh blood draws. People want these new faces. For better or for worse, Marco Rubio is always going to be a much more electrifying grassroots figure than Saxby Chambliss, and I think there's a delicate balancing act there. Something I'm curious about also from you, Jordan, is we talked about Sarah Palin a bit. What do you think about her role in the Republican Party? What's your take on the Palin legacy as far as future of the GOP?
Do you really think she's going to have one?
Well, here's what's interesting about Palin is that she's just universally maybe not reviled, but she was a punchline for 2 years. I don't think she's definitely not respected as a serious thinker or an idea person, but at the same time, like Rubio, Cruz, Rand Paul, Nikki Haley, a lot of very impressive politicians got elected after getting support from her. I think Cruz has said he wouldn't be a senator if not for the Palin endorsement. Palin was instrumental in supporting Deb Fischer in Nebraska, and I think a lot of the diversity, a lot of the youth in the conservative movement is coming from grassroots support that Palin can rally in a way that a lot of DC RNC types can't. And I don't be a Palin apologist or be like, the GOP's fine, guys, we have Sarah Palin. But at the same time, like, theoretically, let's play the Rubio in the White House thought experiment. Let's say he wins in 2016. That's because of Sarah Palin. That would be a big deal.
Well, people were writing her post or her eulogies after she was dropped from Fox News. I guess earlier this year, late last year, something like that.
Yeah.
But I think I tend to think of Sarah Palin as kind of what you mentioned earlier, as kind of emblematic of all the of a lot of bad tendencies in the GOP and in the conservative movement. But more than that, I think it's problematic to think of her as the kind of the queen of the grassroots, because there are plenty of because frankly I don't think it's giving the grassroots enough credit. I don't think she's not their Pied Piper, I guess.
Is there a person who is, or are there people who have similar Pied Piping talents?
I guess there are a lot of people that would like to claim that mantle, like you have the various Tea Party groups, some of which are more connected to mainstream Washington, some of them aren't.
Eric Erickson.
Yeah, someone like that. But he's a lot more measured, Right. I guess he might even be the person I choose as maybe the Pied Piper rather than Sarah Palin, which is good because at least I consider it a good thing that he doesn't have political aspirations, or apparently doesn't. There was I guess there's rumors about him possibly running in Georgia, but
yeah, I think it's gonna happen. I don't see that happening. Yeah, right. Interesting. Cool. Good talk.
Right. Should we sign off? Is that I guess we're at almost 40 minutes.
Yeah, so we call it.
All right, sounds good.
Great.
Nice talking to you, Betsy.
Fun. Yeah, you too. Thanks to everyone at Blogging Heads for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Blogging Heads.